is my pleasure to introduce our third and final speaker of the day, Leah Burch. Leah is an ESRC-funded 1+3 student based in the School of Sociology and Social Policy here at the University of Leeds. She also teaches disability studies at Liverpool Hope University, where she completes their degree and her master's, and she's interested in disablist hate crime, and her work uncovers instances of everyday disablist hate and hate speech. Leah is also interested in education policy, specifically related to special education needs. Impressively, given that she's only in the first year of her PhD, Leah already has 4 articles published or in press, 3 in Disability and Society and 1 in the Journal of Education Policy. She also has several comments from the field published in the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies. And the title of Leah's presentation today is They should be exterminated like the wild animals they are, animalising disability through hate speech. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you very much. You made me sound a lot better than possibly I am. But yeah, I'm going to talk today, coming much more from disability studies, I think. So thank you for the other talks of the day as well. I must admit, animal studies isn't where I come from. All of my research has kind of emerged through disability studies, so it's been really interesting hearing your research, hearing what you've been doing, but also trying to make these connections between my own research and animal studies. So it's been really interesting. But I should also say that I am only at the very beginning of starting to develop these connections, so any kind of helpful, kind, constructive feedback would be really nice in taking it forward. Ryan does have an online copy of the presentation as well, and I'm more than happy to try and share it if anyone does want it after. And then just the last presentation of the day, I'm really sorry, it's really quite gloomy. It's quite a depressing topic, quite a difficult one, but hopefully it's nearly the end of the day, so it shouldn't be too bad. Yeah, I come from disability studies, so not really animal studies, and I just thought I'd kind of acknowledge the way that disability studies has really grown as a discipline. So emerging in the kind of 1970s through the struggles of disabled people, disabled activists, it's really, really expanded since then, and there's an array of different books about disability studies. There's a number of courses as well now across the UK and in the US and elsewhere in the world. So it's a really, really great discipline to be in, and there's definitely interdisciplinary potential with a lot of other areas of study. So when I first was asked by Ryan to talk about this, I thought I'd try and trace some of the history of animalisation and disability and think about where the relationship between disabled people and animals had been quite well established, and definitely not as far back as, you know, as Sunny and Karen have gone back, but just thinking really about the sideshows or the freak shows, where disabled people who were deemed to be disfigured were very much animalised and put forward as a spectacle in these freak shows. So you've got Julia Pastrana and the Penguin Lady. So both of these women were put on display as spectacles throughout their lives. And Julia Pastrana, who was also known as Baboon Woman and Ape Woman, also once she died, her husband and manager, Theodore Lent, he had her body embalmed and then continued to tour with her body until he died. So it was quite a money-making business. And this was done, according to Taylor, by really animalising these bodies. So Taylor explains that in the spectacle that was the sideshow, animality was front and centre, with the most demeaning of animal comparisons being reserved for people of colour and intellectually disabled people. In the sideshow, animality was used to spark the imagination by transgressing common categories and distinctions with theatrics and spectacle. So possibly a less kind of explicit relationship between disability and animals. I thought I should kind of acknowledge institutionalisation and the asylums where disabled people were locked in for some time. So these places, so you've got Bethlehem on the far side, these places were really, really not nice places to be around. So disabled people were often locked inside, and they'd be tied to beds with belts, wrist strapped and locked gloves. They were often confined in nude states with little dignity, and also left for really long periods of time to sit and lie in soiled and wet areas. So also what that took place in these institutions was a number of different tests for medical research, and one of the most famous one I think is lobotomy, which is really quite a horrific experiment that went on when you think about it. Interestingly, lobotomy was first tested on dogs and chimps, I found, and then it was brought into the asylums and used on disabled people. So it first was where 2 holes would be drilled on either side of the front of the skull, and then electric shocks would be sent into the brain. And then it was adapted over time where a hammer would insert an instrument into the eye sockets. And then, so what I thought as well is that there was this relationship then between animals and disabled people, where both animals and disabled people have traditionally been used as medical tests. So they've been made tools to scientists' expense. And what I found really quite interesting, also quite depressing, is that in the Reddit comments that I analysed online, there was many suggestions that we should only keep severely disabled children alive to be used in medical research. So there's still this suggestion going on right now. So coming into more of a recent context, the relationship between animalisation and disablist hate crime. Kevin Davis and Stephen Huskin are 2 particularly disturbing cases of disablist hate crime, although not referred to that in law. So I think it was 2007 that both of these individuals were murdered. They were murdered by so-called friends that treated them as slaves, locked them in garden sheds. Kevin Davis had a cross branded on his buttocks, and both individuals had dog collars around their neck and were dragged around the floor within their own settings as well. So this was in their home, but the perpetrators had come inside and did this to them. So here again, there's this relationship between animals and disability, the way that these individuals were made to resemble animals, so being dragged around the floor in that power relationship that I think is quite evident. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research now then. So you are a parasite on the productive classes. These are not my words. It's one of the comments that I analysed from the research project. It's a piece of research that I did at Liverpool Hope University a couple of years ago, and it has recently been published, as Ryan said, in Disability and Society. So I do have some copies if anyone wants, quite depressing read, and there's also a link there that will take you straight to the online journal article. So one of the most quite obvious, quite explicit examples of animalising disability through hate speech on Reddit was the naming of disabled people as parasites, particularly as it came up in a welfare climate. So people commented, "I am not food, my money gets stolen to feed all kinds of parasites. You are a parasite on the productive class, and all parasites should perish. You do not have any right to exist on the involuntary backs of others." So the use of parasite in this context then is quite revealing of the way that people were expressing disgust and resentment towards disabled people within this period of financial instability. So in etymological terms, a parasite describes a hanger-on, a person who lives off others, one who lives at another's expense, and a person who eats at the table of another. So in other words, then, it presents the assumption of burden and scrounger that has been very much presented in really familiar media representations of disability as burdens within the welfare system, and particularly as burdens to the hard-working taxpayer. So by likening disabled people then to parasites, it makes this explicit tug towards disabled people and towards this narrative where the ordinary hard-working taxpayer, so the decent citizen as it's usually described, becomes the victim of injustice. And these people are victims of injustice at the expense of disabled people and the welfare climate. So these comments are explicitly negative and derogatory towards disabled people, and they naturalise the exclusion of disabled people within a society that's very much centred around employability and economic productivity. So it presents a social crisis where where unconstrained market forces destroy social bonds. So there's no interdependency suggested in any of these comments, but disabled people are not granted the status of human because of the notion of responsibility, productivity and independence that surrounds the way in which we perceive the human in the current day. So one way that I thought of theorising this and trying to think about it in relation to animal studies was through mechanic dehumanisation. So this process refers to where individuals are denied humanness through the lacking of human nature characteristics such as cognitive flexibility, emotional reactivity and individuality. So I think when we think back to the cases that I've just outlined, so the use of parasites, disabled people are mechanically dehumanised, not simply through the naming of parasite, but also the narrative that underpins the use of parasite. So disabled people are perceived to lack pro-social values of the neoliberal, ideal, hard-working citizen, and then therefore are judged to be less than human and then unworthy of equal treatment. So another theme that really kind of brought animals and disability together was reproduction. So specifically the element of elimination, so both in terms of preventing people's rights to reproduce and then also through the justified killing of disabled people, which I'll come on to next. So in relation to the reproductive rights, comments suggested that disabled people should not be allowed to procreate. This kind of idea reinforces the superior positions of so-called normative humans and thus their right to then tame the other figure in means of preventing the reproduction of others. So this assumption demonstrates the process of animalistic dehumanisation, which is described as the denial of uniquely human characteristics such as intelligence, moral sensibility and self-control. So animalistic dehumanisation is evident in the explicit likening of disabled people to animals that's made in the suggestion that we should castrate them. Castration is most commonly referred to in terms of animals and not really commonly used when we're thinking about humans. So in this sense then, the comment is referring to disabled people implicitly as animalised by suggesting that we subject them to a process most commonly related to non-human animals. So, in addition, animalised dehumanisation is made apparent in the suggested lack of self-control and intelligence of disabled people, which, based upon this, makes it morally justifiable to remove the right of disabled people to reproduce. So many users made the point that disabled people were incapable of looking after children and therefore shouldn't be allowed to do so. So one user argued that children actually die because of abuse and negligence from mentally retarded parents, and this can be prevented by taking their right away to have a baby. So reinforcing this perspective, others suggested that we should just stop them having sex and that there must be a brain structure of sufficient complexity in order to have moral rights, such as the right to reproduce. So in these cases, disabled people are subject to what I would suggest is animalised dehumanisation because they're presented to lack the knowledge, control and capability that defines notions of humanness and humanity, and therefore not allowed the right to reproduce. So the question of death that was put it was quite common in the comments that I was reading, and it was an unexpected theme that really came up. It wasn't something that I particularly anticipated when I started doing the research, but it was really quite significant. So noting just a few examples, many users advocated that we should euthanise the severely retarded, predicated upon the perceived lack of quality of life as well as economic burden. One use describes a disabled child as a creature that would never fully develop, as a justification for euthanisation. They suggested that it was much kinder to actually end the life of these children rather than let them continue to grow up. So this was a really common and popular assumption within some of the Reddit threads that I analysed. And just to give you kind of an idea, some of the Reddit threads, so the title of the threads, were called "I believe that children with severe mental handicap should be killed at birth," "Aborting a fetus that has a severe disability shouldn't be looked down upon," and "I don't see the joy in raising a mentally handicapped child." So many others, in order to justify the murder of disabled people, called upon the very familiar story of economic resources, arguing that the impact of not having to care for the weak and powerless would have incredible economic benefits to society, that disabled people are muddying up the gene pool, and that if euthanasia was more acceptable, we could become the master species with no imperfections. So this narrative echoes the justification of mass murder and sterilisation of disabled people under the T4 programme of the Nazi regime, and I think it's a narrative that many of us would like to have thought was something of the past, and that not something that wasn't still being reproduced and reinforced in today's society. So these comments explicitly deny any sense of humanness of disabled people and thus deny the right to life. In addition, further comments of the same message nudge to the animalisation of disabled people. So comments advocating that we should put them down and put down the downers not only reinforces the eugenic values that justified mass murder, but equally, the action of putting something down again is most notably referred to non-human animals rather than humans. So presenting this message in even more explicit terms, one user suggested that disabled people should be exterminated like the wild animals they are. So when I came back to these comments and I was thinking about them today for this presentation today, it reminded me of the words of biologist Erwin Bohr and anthropologist Martin Stamler, two key influences of Nazi doctrine. So in their words, as Bauman cites, "Every farmer knows that he should slaughter the best specimens of his domestic animals without letting them procreate, and should instead continue breeding inferior individuals. His breeds would degenerate hopelessly. This mistake, which no farmer would commit with his animals and cultivated plants, we permit to go on in our midst to a large extent. As a recompense for our humanness of today, we must see to it that these inferior people do not procreate." So I think what this really shows is that both historically and today, so in today's society, these human-animal comparisons have justified the subjugation, the murder, and the incarceration of disabled people, and there's clearly some links between them. So I wanted to really try and bring these together, so bring animal studies and disability studies together. But from someone who doesn't really come from animal studies, it was quite difficult, but I do think with some development there's possibly some connections to be made. So when I did try and do this, it's evident that both disabled people and animals have been portrayed as less than human, and then as a result been subject to mistreatment. So what's more, there is evidence of disabled people being treated like non-human animals as a means of positioning disability as an other category outside the parameters of the normative human. So as a result of this distance between the human and the disabled person, the mistreatment's then justified and accepted. So describing the significance of this distance, Helen Fine writes about the universe of obligation. So this universe designates the outer limits of the social territory inside which moral questions may be asked at all with any sense. On the other side of the boundary, moral precepts do not bind and moral evaluations are meaningless. To render the humanity of victims invisible, one needs merely to evict them from the universe of obligation. So from this perspective, from this understanding, when something or someone is placed outside of this universe of obligation, it seems that any sense of moral responsibility towards them is lost. And it was interesting because this idea of distance is one of the central theoretical frameworks when researching hate crime. So it's something that we talk about quite a lot in hate crime research, that both through the act of hate crime, the distance between the perpetrator and the victim is justified and also enhanced. So it reinforces the perceived superior position of the perpetrator and therefore reinforces the power inequalities going on. So with this in mind, I do think that the significance of categorisation and the sense of distance that's established, I do think there are clear links to be made between the two disciplines of focus today. So there's been a shift in recent years in the field of disability studies towards more of a post-humanist approach to research and disability. So from this perspective, the focus is not necessarily to humanise disability, as has traditionally been the case, but to trouble this very idea of the human, and that as long as we're still holding on to this notion, we're always going to exclude disabled people. So a post-humanist approach deconstructs the systems and processes that produce the category of human as something that's unique and central to life on this earth. As James Overbow argues, a key scholar in post-humanist disability studies, the spectre of being a person, subject or self haunts the discipline of disability studies. Thus, Overbow in his work urges us to let go of this desire to humanity and instead appreciate the affirmative potential of the impersonal registry of the inhuman. So Overbow's work's very influenced by the work of Deleuze and Guattari, and he calls for a recognition of the inhuman in his own pursuit of destabilising the natural order of things in favour of his own uncontained and uncontrollable body. So affirming his spasmodic desires, as he writes, I would much rather feel the world, taste it and smell it, and wear it even as it wears me out. I'd much rather have my painfully smelly, dirty, and ultimately uncontrollable body that transcends my corporal being. So as these words illustrate, Overbow embodies this sense of the inhuman and enters into a state to which norms and categories simply don't exist. His affirmation of the inhuman allows him to escape the shackles of humanism that I think so many of us are possibly caught within. So I think it's possible here then, the uptaking of a post-humanist, non-anthropocentric perspective that might enable us to bring disability studies and animal studies together in order to remove the consequences of othering and categorisation and then ultimately liberate both disabled people and animals. So with this then I came to the dishuman. So the dishuman has been suggested more recently by Dan Goodley, Catherine Runswick-Cole and peers, and perhaps presents more of a middle ground. So the dishuman both troubles and asserts humanity, recognising that it's often the recognition of humanity that affirms the rights and opportunities that many disabled people aspire to achieve. So that there is still this sense of humanism that people desire, because ultimately it's this that can guarantee access to things. So positioned at the intersection of disability and post-human politics, the dishuman disavows normative constructions of humanity by both desiring and rejecting the human category simultaneously. So in this way, the dishuman presents an opportunity to open up spaces where the category of human can be reimagined through the experiences and the knowledge of self-identified disabled people. So as Catherine Runswick-Cole suggests, it presents a heterotopic space where we can destabilise notions of ableism by equipping, desiring and rejecting the practices they inform. So, as I explained at the beginning, and really would emphasise, I'm only very recently coming into the scholarship of animal studies, and really at the very beginning of trying to make these connections. So what I've presented today are just preliminary thoughts on something that hopefully I'll go on to develop. So I do think that there are clear links that can be made between animal studies and disability studies, as the history of oppression and marginalisation for both groups appear to intersect at some point. So whilst I don't believe that we should amalgamate the experiences of animals and disabled people, I do think there are some links to be made. The findings from my own research suggest that disabled people often are dehumanised and animalised through disablist hate speech, where the synonymisation of disabled people with animals serves a number of purposes. So it confirms a sense of distance, it reaffirms the perceived superiority of the perpetrator, and it justifies these, which are like pretty disgusting comments. And I was really shocked to have come across them all. So with this in mind then, I think that there is scope to explore in more depth how troubling the very notion of human may come to liberate both animals and disabled people. By disrupting the assumptions, values and norms that currently underpin notions of humanness, it's possible to refashion the concept to one that begins with disability. In doing so, it's possible to challenge the narrow criteria that's traditionally been placed upon disabled people, and therefore push both disabled people and animals to the peripheries of this sense of humanness. So I agree with the words of Dan Goodley, Rebecca Lawtham and Catherine Munswick-Cole, and suggest that the emerging politics of the dishuman critically engage with post-human thoughts to tease open a space where alternative ways of being and becoming can reshape the identity and practice of humanism. Thank you.